I've been using the term emotional dysregulation preponderantly. Look it up. Emotional dysregulation. It gives the impression of some kind of paroxysm or seizure or a sudden, abrupt, terrifying loss of control. It is reminiscent of the phenomenon of switching in borderline personality disorder. I dedicate a video to this. But actually, there is little real understanding of this underlying psychodynamic, which is common in borderline personality disorder, but also makes its appearance in narcissistic personality disorder and in other unrelated mental health issues, for example, some kinds of mood disorders and so on. So today I want to delve deeper into this emotional dysregulation thingy known in Europe and the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, as emotional instability. So there's emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is the other name for borderline personality disorder. Emotional instability or instability, emotional dysregulation, that's a fun ride that is awaiting you, dear viewers. And who am I to guide you through all this? I am the emotionally regulated professor of psychology, Sam Vaknin, and also the author of the emotionally dysregulated book, Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, the first book to have ever described narcissistic abuse. Let us sink deeper and immerse ourselves in the crazy-making world of cluster B personality disorders, overwhelmed by emotions, affective dysregulation in borderlines and narcissists. The first thing we need to understand is that dysregulation, emotional dysregulation, also known as affective dysregulation, is induced by both positive affects and negative affects. Both positive emotions and negative emotions can and do induce dysregulation in people with a premorbid state, or people with a personality disorder. That's point number one. So if you are in love, or if you've just been rejected, humiliated, and abandoned publicly, in both cases, you may end up reacting with emotional dysregulation if you have borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder. Number two, there are two types of emotional dysregulation, and regrettably, they are not sufficiently demarcated in the literature. There is anticipatory emotional dysregulation, and there is reactive emotional dysregulation. Let me explain the difference, and it is a vast, very crucial difference. Anticipatory emotional dysregulation is when the individual is anxious, develops anxiety, because the individual is catastrophizing. So, for example, when the borderline anticipates, fully expects abandonment and rejection and regards them as inevitable, ineluctable, nothing she can do about it, out of her control. There's an external locus of control. Her fate, her moods, her emotions are determined from the outside. This anxiety, this catastrophizing, this anticipation of the worst can and do induce emotional dysregulation. That's one type. The other type of emotional dysregulation has to do with reactance or reactivity. It is triggered by something. So it is post facto. It is after the fact. It's emotional dysregulation that, for example, happens in the wake of actual abandonment or in the aftermath of ostentatious, conspicuous public humiliation and rejection. In all these cases, there is reactive emotional dysregulation. Point number three, dysregulation is not the same as emotional chaos or emotional disorganization or emotional disorder. It's not the same. It's not about chaos. It's not about mayhem. It's not about a vortex, all-consuming whirlpool. This image of, as I said, a paroxysm or a seizure. That's epilepsy. That's not borderline personality disorder. So it's not about this. It's also actually, in my view, not about instability of emotions. It's not about lability. There's a confusion, including in the ICD, between lability and dysregulation. Many people have labile moods and labile affects, ups and downs, depression, euphoria, intense love, less intense love. So there are gradations, and there's a spectra, and there are continua of emotions and so on. But instability is not the same as dysregulation. Therefore, emotionally unstable personality disorder in the ICD is a bad choice of words. Again, we should not confuse lability with dysregulation. Lability is a form of cycling. Even in extreme cases, lability can involve switching. Dysregulation is something completely different. Dysregulation also doesn't have anything to do with amplification or magnification of emotions. We have this image of the emotion as a wave, a tsunami that somehow carries you and then bangs you against debris and walls and then destroys you and drowns you and I don't know what. This tsunami imagery, this tsunami metaphor is wrong. Emotional dysregulation is not about the intensity of the emotion, not about even about the abruptness or suddenness of the emotion. It's not about the traits, it's not about the characteristics of the emotion. So it's not about amplifying or magnifying the emotion. Emotional dysregulation or affective dysregulation is a form of lack of regulation. I think dysregulation gives the wrong impression. I think the correct term should have been a-regulation, no regulation, absence of regulation, unregulation. So when regulatory mechanisms cease to operate somehow, are compromised, hindered, impeded, reversed, then we have dysregulation. It's absence of regulation. It is a form of internal decompensation and disinhibition. What happens is all the defenses collapse and all the inhibitions vanish. And then we have a disinhibited state, which by definition is not regulated. And the last point I want to make before I go into the territory of definitions and what we know and clinical data and clinical information, before I go into all this, for clinicians mainly, the last point I want to make is that emotional dysregulation has a lot to do with appraisal failure. Catastrophizing is a form of appraisal failure. Appraisal is the cognitive evaluation of the nature and significance of some phenomenon or some event, including an internal process. So when you evaluate, when you appraise, when you gauge an internal process or an external process, something, that is called appraisal. In emotional dysregulation, there's a failure of appraisal. The events, and when I say event, it's a general term for everything, including internal dynamics. They are events. Internal dynamics are kinds of events, internal events. So when the individual fails to correctly appraise the event, its nature, its strength, its future, its path, its developmental path, its how threatening it is, how promising it is. When there's a failure of appraisal, often the outcome is catastrophizing, tending to unrealistically predict disasters and negative outcomes. So the catastrophizing generates anxiety, and the anxiety leads to dysregulation. So there's appraisal failure involved. Okay, let's get acquainted with a few terms that have an intimate relationship with emotional dysregulation. And by the way, as a side note, it's very interesting to realize that intimacy is intimately connected to emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation is much more common in intimate relationships, and that raises fascinating questions. Number one, why? What in intimacy generates dysregulation and disinhibition and a total collapse of defenses and so on and so forth? Why is intimacy so threatening, so destabilizing? What in intimacy leads the individual to let go of any attempt to control his or her internal environment? Well, of course, we are talking about pathological forms of intimacy. For example, merger and fusion, enmeshment. In these situations, there is an outsourcing of internal functions, including ego functions, to another person. And then the risk of losing that other person is immense. It's like losing yourself. So there is amplification and magnification, not of the emotions, but of the situation, of intimacy as an all-encompassing, all-engulfing envelope or bubble or globe within which your chances to get hurt, your chances to suffer are much heightened. In other words, intimacy is perceived as a threat that inevitably leads to pain and hurt and brokenness and damage. That's why intimacy is connected with emotional dysregulation. Okay, a few terms, a few clinical terms. Emotional charge. Emotional charge is usually a strong emotion. It could be anger, but it could also be love. It's important to understand that positivity and negativity are value judgments. Positivity and negativity are social constructs. They're imposed from the outside. As far as the mind is concerned, what matters is the existence of the emotion, the functions of the emotion, and the intensity, the amplitude of the emotion. The rest doesn't matter. So love can be as threatening, as destabilizing, as hate or anger or envy. Negative affectivity and positive affectivity are equipotent in their capacity to induce dysregulation. So a strong emotion, anger, love, whatever the case may be, conceived as being bottled up under pressure and ready to explode, is known as an emotional charge. Emotions are negatively or positively charged, and when they're bottled up, this primes the ground for an eruption, a volcanic eruption or an earthquake. Emotional charge is one of the elements, one of the components of emotional dysregulation. And the second one is emotional blocking. Emotional blocking has to do with the inhibition of emotions, or actually more precisely, the inhibition of thought, speech, and other responses due to extreme emotion. So when there's an extreme emotion, sometimes we go emotionally numb. We have reduced affect display. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are actually forms of emotional dysregulation. So emotional dysregulation doesn't have to be the equivalent of a temper tantrum or a paroxysm or a seizure or some kind of insane display of acting out. No. Emotional dysregulation could result in the exact opposite, a catatonia-like freezing, numbness, lack of affect, automatic, robotic conduct, denuding the individual of any élan vital, of any life force, kind of decaffecting or taking away the libido, if you wish. I don't know which other metaphors to use. So this is also a form of emotional dysregulation, because all forms of emotional dysregulation involve emotional conflict. Emotional conflict is a disharmonious, dissonant state because they are incompatible intense emotions, or because the intensity itself is perceived as ego dystonic, as unacceptable to the individual, uncomfortable, unpleasant, and also socially unacceptable. So emotional conflict sets the ground for emotional dysregulation. Emotional blocking is one form of emotional dysregulation. Emotional charge is the other form of emotional dysregulation. This state of disharmony, which is the breeding grounds for emotional dysregulation, is irresolvable. The conflict is perceived as irreconcilable. There's no solution. So, for example, ambivalence is such a case. In ambivalence, we hate and love the same person. Cognitive dissonance of some types prime the ground for emotional dysregulation. Intense emotions that are perceived as threatening and all-consuming and all-devouring, such intense emotions would also generate emotional conflict. And as I said, when your emotions are perceived to be socially unacceptable, loathsome, condemnable, uncomfortable, unpleasant, dissonant, then you would also tend to dysregulate. In other words, emotional dysregulation is a form of distress. It's a distress signal, but it also reifies distress. It is distress. It's just the way distress manifests and expresses itself. One of the big problems of people with emotional dysregulation is a feature, as a clinical feature, people with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. One of the big problems is that they lack emotional cognition. Their emotional cognition is compromised. Emotional cognition is just another name for mentalization or theory of mind. Yeah? It's the ability to recognize and interpret the emotions of other people. We gather all kinds of cues like facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, and of course, explicit speech acts, verbal acts. And then we put all these together, we create a theory. Create a theory about the other person, and we interpret another person's feeling, emotions correctly or incorrectly. If our emotional cognition is compromised, if it's low, then we would tend to interpret other people's emotions wrongly most of the time, which would create situations which are at minimum awkward and at maximum dangerous, and would lead to emotional dysregulation, because emotions are reactive to the environment. We'll talk about it in a minute. When we delineate the distinction between feelings, emotions, and affects, you will see that emotions are directional. We love someone. We hate someone. It always has a direction. It has an arrow. It's environmentally responsive. So when we misinterpret the emotions of other people on a consistent basis, because our emotional cognition is impaired or compromised, we are very likely to create situations where our own emotions would be misinterpreted by us. Emotional cognition goes both ways, public facing outwardly and inwardly. And so the impairment of emotional cognition is associated with a range of psychological conditions. For example, autism spectrum disorder. But I think it's high time to introduce this element into the study of emotional dysregulation. Of course, emotional cognition goes hand in hand with empathy. So as a prediction, we could say that people with reduced empathy, compromised empathy, partial empathy are much more likely to experience emotional dysregulation, and this truly is the case. Emotional disturbance is a fear, anxiety, or other emotionally based condition that results in maladaptive behavior. So the individual experiences the emotional disturbance, and emotional dysregulation, of course, is one form, one kind, one variant of emotional disturbance. So then this kind of individual who has this unpleasant experience, unpleasant is the understatement of the century, this kind of individual is likely to develop behavioral strategies which are maladaptive, dysfunctional, withdrawal, avoidance, isolation, acting out, externalized aggression. They're all attempts to cope with one's own emotions and how these emotions threaten to overwhelm the system because there's no regulation present. And so this, of course, has implications in real life and functioning. And so there is a debate to which extent emotional dysregulation could be diagnosed in children. And I think it's a spurious debate. I don't think there's any question that children can and are very often, can be and are very often emotionally dysregulated. And there is even a diagnosis which pertains to children. It's known as serious emotional disturbance, SED. But I will not go into it right now. Maybe I'll dedicate a special video to emotional dysregulation in children. Right now we are focused on adults. And so what do you do when you constantly misinterpret the emotions of other people? This triggers in you emotions that are alien to you and that you misinterpret equally, and you're terrified by this situation because you feel that you are like a puppet and everyone is pulling your strings. Well, one solution is what is known as emotional dissemblance. Emotional dissemblance is a lack of correspondence between an individual's internal affective state and the outward expression of these emotions. So it could be intentional. Dissemblance could be intentional. The individual is lying about their emotional state. But dissemblance is often unconscious, where the individual's emotional broadcast, emotional facade, emotional emanations are actually ill-correlated or lowly correlated with what's really going on inside. And this discrepancy, this gap, creates internal tension because it's dissonant. And this tension accumulates and becomes anxiety, and the anxiety finally shuts off all the regulatory mechanisms, and we have emotional dysregulation. You're beginning to see that emotional dysregulation has many sources, and that it has consequently many facets or many aspects, some of them mutually exclusive and irreconcilable. So it's a very wide spectrum phenomenon. And when I say emotional dysregulation, of course, I'm talking about emotions. So what are emotions? And in which way emotions are not the same as feelings or not the same as affects? So what are we talking about? Let us define these words before we proceed. It is important to understand that many scholars believe that emotions are just one type of cognitions. They're kind of thought that is experienced in a different way to cognition, but they're still cognitions. Be that as it may, emotions are complex. They're not simple. There is not a single simple emotion. When you say anger, when you say love, when you say hate, when you say envy, it's a complex thing. And emotions, as I said earlier, are directional. They're outward or public facing, outward looking. They are reactive to the environment. Emotions are reaction patterns, and they involve many elements, experiential elements, behavioral elements, even physiological elements. We can induce emotions through the body. We can even induce emotions through visual input. We can induce emotions. There's famous experiments where people experience, in the experiment, people were made to experience tachycardia, like a faster heartbeat. And then they were shown pictures, photos of potential partners, and they said that they were falling in love. So the body informed the mind. So emotions emerge from the body very often. And emotions are there because we weigh things differently. Some things are more important to us. Something are more significant. Some things are perceived as threats or a menace. Some things are perceived as crucial for survival. And so this system of weighing or weighting things is regulated or mediated, I would say, via emotions. Emotions attempt, it's an attempt, an emotion is an attempt to deal with a personally significant matter, person, or event, the specific quality of the emotion. Anything from shame to love, from fear to anger, specific quality is determined by the specific significance of the object of the emotion. Be that another person, be that a decision, be that an environment, be that an institution, whatever the object of the emotion is, we love someone, we hate someone, whatever and whoever that someone is, this determines the profile of the emotion and the quality of the emotion. If the significance involves threat, fear is likely to be generated. If the significance involves disapproval, shame is likely to emerge. And if the significance is about, having found your soulmate, the reaction would probably be love. Sex appeal or attractiveness would generate infatuation and limerence. Emotion typically involves feeling, but it's not the same as feeling because it has an overt or implicit engagement with the world. And this is where dysregulation comes in. Because the world can and does dysregulate people. Reality dysregulates people. The environment dysregulates people. Emotional dysregulation is often induced from the outside, not from the inside. In other words, the perception that emotional dysregulation is a wholly contained psychodynamic process is manifestly wrong. And unfortunately, underlies most of the literature on personality disorders, especially borderline and narcissistic. It's completely wrong. The same individual with borderline personality disorder is likely to not react with emotional dysregulation or react with emotional dysregulation, depending crucially on the environment, on the intimate partner, on the type of relationship, on expectations, on previous experiences, including immediate experiences, on cues, on triggers, on stimuli, it's an endless array of possibilities, of switches. So it's wrong to characterize emotional dysregulation as emanating from the inside, confined to the inside, like some kind of caged animal in the zoo of personality disorders. I said that emotion contains feeling, but is outwardly directed at the world. It's a mode of engaging with the world. You could even conceive of emotions as forms of communication, as signaling, a type of signaling. For example, anger is intended to signal displeasure and modify people's behavior. So there is a manipulative element in emotions. When we communicate emotions, we expect other people to comply, to somehow alter, change and modify their behaviors to reduce the intensity or even the existence of the emotion. You see that emotions are much more complex than I get up in the morning and I'm angry. They have to do with a strategy for surviving within a specific environment in an adaptive way. They are, I would say, evolutionary survival strategies, and also at the same time, signaling mechanisms and communication modes. Feelings are much more primitive. Feelings are much more basic. A feeling is a self-contained phenomenal experience. So when most scholars, and not to mention self-styled experts and laymen, discuss emotional dysregulation, they actually mean to say feeling dysregulation. Feeling is indeed self-contained, and it's an experience, and there is a phenomenology to it, but it's self-contained. Its feelings are subjective, they're evaluative, they're independent of sensations, thoughts, or images that evoke them. Independent. They are not reactive like emotions. Feelings are inevitably evaluated as pleasant or unpleasant, but they can have more specific intrapsychic qualities. So the affective tone of the feeling could be determined in a variety of ways. For example, the affective tone of fear is experienced as different to the affective tone of anger. The core characteristics that differentiate feeling from cognitive or sensory or perceptual intrapsychic experiences is the fact that affect is connected to appraisal. You remember appraisal? We discussed appraisal earlier. It's like building blocks. There's affect, there's appraisal. Put these two together, you get a feeling. Direct the feeling outwardly at the environment and you get an emotion. Feelings differ to emotions. They're purely mental, whereas emotions are designed to engage with the world, but otherwise feelings are a crucial component of emotions. What about affects? We keep saying affective dysregulation. Affects are not emotions. Affect is the experience of feeling, the experience of emotion. It's how you experience these things. Suffering, for example, is not an emotion. It's an affect. You experience suffering, and suffering is a composite of multiple emotions. You experience elation similarly. There are simple affects, complex affects, depending on the ingredients or on the composition of the affect, on what comprises the affect. Because feelings and emotions could also be simple or complex. There's normal affect, pathological affect, because emotional reactions could be normal or pathological. And of course, ultimately, there is reduced affect or even lack of affect, known as flat affect. That is a form of numbing, self-numbing, which implies the utter failure of regulation, a failure that threatens the individual from the inside and forces the individual to shut down the entire emotional mechanism. Affect can be positive or negative. Mood and emotion are affective states, but they are not affects. Along with cognition and conation, I have a video dedicated to conation, by the way, affect is one of three traditionally identified components of the mind. Now, what is positive affect? Positive affect is the internal feeling state, the affect that occurs when something good has happened to you. A goal has been attained. A source of threat has been removed or avoided. You have accomplished your dream or your wish, fulfilled your wish. You're satisfied with the present state of affairs, whatever the case may be. When you experience such states, this is called positive affectivity. In emotionally dysregulated people, people with borderline personality disorder and to some extent narcissistic personality disorder, positive affect and negative affect are indistinguishable from each other. The valence, the value of the affect, plus or minus, is not relevant. The very existence of the affect can and sometimes generates emotional instability, emotional dysregulation, shuts off the regulatory mechanism. Affect is not tolerated. It's as if these kind of individuals have an allergic reaction to affect. Whenever affect is present, there's a risk that the whole house of cards will fall apart and the individual will be overwhelmed and reduced to sobbing or reduced to inactivity, a catatonic state. Now, in narcissism, emotional dysregulation is totally context dependent. Narcissists emotionally dysregulate only in highly specific states. Collapse, narcissistic mortification, and sometimes narcissistic injuries. It was Kernberg who suggested that narcissism is actually a defense against emotional dysregulation, a defense against borderline personality disorder or borderline personality organization. So narcissism is the opposite of emotional dysregulation. It's a solution to emotional dysregulation. It's a pathological solution, dysfunctional solution, hurtful solution, crazy solution, but it's a solution. It reduces the incidence of emotional dysregulation in the individual. However, narcissism, like any solution, is not fail-safe. It sometimes fails. And when it fails, we have emotional dysregulation. The individual narcissist actually becomes clinically indistinguishable from a borderline patient. Negative affect, positive affect. Negative affect is the internal feeling that occurs when you fail to achieve a goal, or when there is a threat present, or when you're not satisfied with your life, or whatever the case may be. Negative affectivity, positive affectivity in healthy people, very different in mental ill people, people with personality disorders, and people with other kinds of disorders, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, depressive illnesses. In all these people, the positivity or negativity are much less relevant than the existence, the presence, and the intensity of the affect. The affective tone is the mood or the feeling that are associated with a particular experience or stimulus. So the affective tone, most healthy people, most normal people are aware of the affective tone. But mentally unhealthy or mentally disordered people, they are not self-aware in many important ways, and this is no exception. They cannot describe the affective tone, the mood or the feeling associated with any cue or information from the environment or stimulus or experience. They just can't verbalize it. Not only verbalize, they can't really experience it. That's why they find it difficult to communicate it. There is a breakdown between the apparatus or the mechanism of experiencing and the mechanism of emoting and the mechanism of mood. So it's like experiences are objective ontological events and phenomena that give no rise to an emotional correlate, to a feeling, to a mood. It's as if you would say to a healthy person, the sun is 150 million kilometers away from Earth. Okay, that's a cognition, that's a thought, that's a fact, but it doesn't provoke any emotional reaction. But if you were to tell a healthy person, your loved one has just died, that's also a fact, but it would of course provoke an outburst or a total collapse, mentally, emotionally, and so on. With the borderline and the narcissist, the two sentences are indistinguishable as far as the affective tone, as far as the internal experience of them. When you say the earth is that far from the sun, or a loved one died, the narcissist, and to a lesser extent the borderline, register it as neutral statements, as far as inner experience, as far as emoting, as far as... Now, it's not to say that these kind of sentences cannot invoke or provoke or elicit internal dynamics in the narcissist and the borderline. They do, but it is the experience of these dynamics that is either compromised or impaired or lacking. And this distinction is very important. When you tell the borderline your loved one, your intimate partner, has been cheating on you, there's infidelity here, the borderline is likely to erupt in enormous rage, or to collapse completely into a heap, or to fall apart, or to act out, or to do something crazy and self-destructive. Something's definitely going to happen there. And yet the internal experience of all this is mysteriously opaque, inaccessible even to the borderline. She goes through the motions, but she feels compelled from the outside or compelled from the inside, doesn't matter. She feels as if she is a puppet, a marionette. Someone is pulling her strings, someone internal or someone external. It doesn't much matter because she outsources her internality to the outside, so it doesn't matter. This distinction, external and internal, doesn't exist in borderline and in narcissism. So she feels as if she is a plaything, some kind of plaything, flotsam, jetsam on the waves of life. This external locus of control explains the lack of affective tone. And it leads to dysregulation, an excessive, poorly managed kind of environment where regulation ceases to operate. The mechanism, it's very important. Mechanisms that keeps the equilibrium, the homeostasis, the balance, the internal balance, and that creates a semblance of continuity and stability. It's a semblance, but in healthy people, it's a very convincing semblance. It even convinces them. So this mechanism breaks down. And then we have extreme or inappropriate emotional responses to situations, temper outbursts, deliberate self-harm, I mean, you name it. And of course, all this has to do with a lack of regulatory environment. When the regulatory environment is either extremely primitive, habitually outsourced, or prone to breakdowns, very fragile, very vulnerable, then we have the preconditions for a constant state of dysregulation. Self-regulation is when healthy people control their behaviors through the use of self-monitoring. They self-observe. There's introspection here. There's a record of one's previous experiences, life history, behaviors, and so on. It's as if a healthy individual compiles a library as he goes or she goes along life, along the trajectory of life. And this self-observation, this self-monitoring, this introspection, they're critical for regulation because they lead to the next stages of self-evaluation, assessing the information obtained during the self-observation, and self-reinforcement, rewarding oneself for appropriate behavior or attaining a goal, and on the contrary, punishing oneself for having been delinquent or lacking somehow. Self-regulatory processes are very crucial, and they form a part of many therapies like behavior therapies. Now, the problem with people with borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, but as I said, bipolar disorder, autism spectrum disorder, psychological trauma, CPTSD, complex trauma, brain injury even. The problem with all these people is that the components of self-regulation are either out of whack, they don't feed each other appropriately or in a timely fashion, or they are disabled or impaired, compromised dramatically, corrupted somehow, or they collude in trying to destroy the individual, to eliminate the individual. They have a nefarious, malevolent agenda of self-negation, whereas in a healthy person, self-monitoring, self-evaluation, and self-reinforcement would work together in order to enhance, to increase self-efficacy and guarantee positive outcomes from the environment. In a mentally ill person, these very modules will collude, as I said, will conspire to destroy the individual, to reduce self-efficacy, to induce anxiety and dread, to disable and paralyze the individual. So there is an internal fifth column. There's a Trojan horse in these people that attempts to destroy them because they've been brought up to believe that they are unworthy and inadequate and losers and ugly and stupid. The internalized bad object, the primitive superego, or the moral defense. Choose your school in psychology. And so we have this self-regulatory resources theory. It's a model in psychology, and it states that self-regulation depends on global but finite. So there's a global but finite pool of resources. These resources are scarce. They're accessible to all the psychological dynamics. They're accessible to all the psychological constructs and processes. I call them the databases. Yeah, they're accessible, but after all, they're finite. They're scarce. And so they can be depleted by situational demands. And there is something called ego depletion. It's a state marked by a reduction in the capacity for volition, initiative choice, self-regulation, and so on. So when we have a situation where the circumstances, environment, other people, especially significant people, and so on, impose too many demands and requirements and constraints and expectations on the individual, it could create ego depletion. Ego depletion is temporary. The ego is restored to rest. Positive emotions interfere and intervene to mend fences and reconstruct everything, and so on. Volition is replenished. Volition is a faculty by which the individual decides on a particular course of action, commits himself to this course of action. Freud would have called it cathexis. I mean, Freud hated the word cathexis, but it's the equivalent of cathexis. And so when there is no direct external influence, it comes from the inside, volition. It's a crucial set of activities involving the self, choice, decision, self-control, intentional action, active response rather than passive response. And volition depends on a limited resource. This resource is expended whenever the self makes a decision or exerts control or attempts to interact with the environment. So we have this picture of some kind of a pool of resources, some kind of mental energy, or what Freud called psychic energy, and so on. And then it's limited, it's scarce. And whenever you do something, whenever you act, whenever you make a choice, whenever you make a decision, whenever you interact with other people, whenever you attempt to change the environment or modify other people's behaviors, whatever you try to do, you are using up these resources. You're depleting them, and they need to be replenished. So your ego is depleted in the self-regulatory resources theory, and it needs to be replenished. Problem with mentally ill people, people with borderline narcissistic personalities or others, problem with these people is that their capacity to replenish the ego, if you wish, the self, or the resources of the self, their capacity is extremely limited. They are not self-regenerating. They are not self-refreshing. They are not self-reconstructing. And the reason is very simple. They don't possess a self. The self in borderline personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and arguably in other mental illnesses, the self is either fragmented, so not coherent, not cohesive. It's not action-oriented somehow. It is delusional. In psychosis, in narcissism, it's delusional. So impaired reality testing reduces ability to act in the environment or on the environment. It reduces self-efficacy. Something is wrong with the self. In some extreme situations, the self has never been formed. There's been a disruption in the formation of the self. In most of these people, there's identity diffusion, identity disturbance. There's no core identity. There's nobody there. So who's going to do the refreshing and replenishing? There's no one there. No central agent, no executive authority. So these people get depleted very fast. Their resources are much more finite and scarce than the resources of healthy people. Their volition is easily dwindles and wanes and never waxes. And the whole edifice of self-management falls apart, crumbles with every challenge, with every stimulus, with every demand, with every change, with every transformation, with every new person, with every new job, with every new relationship. The whole thing falls apart. Self-management is lacking, and I'm being charitable, in people with these disorders, especially borderline and narcissism. Self-management is the ability to control behavior, especially when a specific objective is in question. Goal-oriented behavior, the pursuit of specific objectives. I don't know, weight loss, for example. Self-management is a desirable aspect of the individual, both personally and socially. But some forms of self-management may be detrimental to mental and physical health. So when self-management goes awry, out of control, when it becomes too rigid, too strict, or on the other hand, when it's completely lacking, when it's missing. Both these situations are very pathological, and they lead to a collapse in self-control. Self-control is the ability to be in command of one's behavior, overt, covert, emotional, physical, and to restrain oneself and to inhibit one's impulses, impulse control. And so when short-term gain is pitted against long-term greater gain, self-control is the ability to opt for the longer-term outcome. So self-control is intimately connected with the notion of time. And indeed, in borderline and narcissism, there's no time, or in other cases like bipolar and so on, time is cyclical. There's no long-term and short-term. There's no term at all. Impulsiveness results if short-term is the equivalent of long-term, because they're both non-existent. The outcome is impulsiveness. And there's no self-discipline. There's no control of one's impulses and desires. Freud would have said that the id takes over and the ego is kind of relinquished or abandoned. And so there's immediate satisfaction in favor, immediate satisfaction instead of delayed gratification or longer term goals. Immediate gratification is the experience of satisfaction or the receipt of a reward as soon as a response is made. And adults and healthy people delay this. They delay gratification because they forego immediate reward in order to obtain a larger, more desired, more pleasurable, bigger reward in the future. There's a concept of the future. There's a horizon. There's ability to extrapolate, to predict. There's a theory. Isn't it a working model of the world, a theory of mind of other people, mentalization? All this is missing. And because all this is missing, everything is immediate, everything is reflexive, everything is responsive, everything is reactive, and it gives no place and no rise to self-regulation, to regulatory mechanisms to operate, because regulation by definition is the ability to suspend immediate responsiveness, immediate reactance, and immediate gratification in favor of longer-term outcomes, internal or external. That's a great definition of regulation. Regulation is about not doing what you want the minute you want to do it. Regulation is about not falling to pieces when you're confronted with a challenge or a difficulty or hardship. Regulation is about not giving in to your infantile and primitive side, imposing on it the strictures and the benefits of social structure as embedded in your higher levels of the mind, especially the adult parts. And there's no such thing in mentally ill people. Freud would have said that in mentally ill people, the pleasure principle prevails over the reality principle. Let me explain this a bit. The pleasure principle is a view that human beings are governed by desires, by drives, by urges for gratification, for pleasure, for the discharge of tension that builds up as pain. When there is internal dissonance or conflict or tension between what you want and what you cannot get, what you want and what society tells you shouldn't pursue. When there are these tensions, the discharge of the tension is by pursuing pleasurable things, pleasurable objects, pleasurable experiences, pleasurable activities, pleasurable people. It's a discharge of the tension, because the tension is experienced as painful or unpleasant when gratification is lacking. So in classical psychoanalytic theory, Sigmund Freud said that the pleasure principle is a force. It's a psychic force, and it motivates people to seek immediate gratification of instinctual, libidinal impulses, sex, hunger, thirst, elimination even, and so on. The pleasure principle dominates the id, operates most strongly during childhood, and later in adulthood, it is opposed by the reality principle as embedded and enshrined in the ego. And this is the pleasure-pain principle versus the reality principle. I'm not necessarily an adherent of all these structures, id, ego, and so on. I think they're metaphors, they're not realities. But I think the dichotomy or the contradiction between pleasure and reality is real. And I think it's a very interesting organizing principle. The reality principle, in classical psychoanalytic theory at least, is the regulatory mechanism. This is regulation. It represents the demands of the external world, and it requires the individual to forego or to modify instinctual gratification, to postpone it to a more appropriate time. It is unlike the pleasure principle, because the pleasure principle is dominant and, as I said, governs the id, the instinctual impulses. The reality principle governs the ego and controls impulses. Reality principle enables people to deal rationally, effectively, and in the long term with the situations and exigencies of life. And it leads to something called self-regulated learning. Self-regulated learning is a process. We continuously monitor and control our learning. We observe everything in every human being, healthy or unhealthy. There is a monitoring agency, a surveillance agency, the NSA, the internal NSA. It's a kind of agency that observes, records, monitors, and so on. So this is a crucial part of self-regulation. Self-regulated learning involves metacognition, cognitive control, motivation, and a strategic use of learning and learned behaviors. And metacognition is the awareness of one's own cognitive processes. I would even say the awareness of one's own emotions, if we adhere to the belief that emotions are cognitive processes. And it involves a conscious attempt to control these emotions and these cognitions. And so metacognition is crucial, and it's missing in borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. They're unable to stand outside themselves, to stand aside and watch themselves and observe themselves as neutrally and objectively as humanly possible. They don't do this. They go with the flow. It's as if they're diving all the time. They never emerge to survey or to look at the landscape. They're constantly underwater. The internal experience of narcissists and borderlines is like they're underwater all the time. And they have to survive somehow underwater. And they are struggling with breathing and other kinds of functions and so on and so forth, just in order to survive. And they have no time for regulation, because everything is in the present, in a bad way. Not mindfulness, but in a bad way. Everything is immediate. Everything is impulsive. Everything is exigent. So everything is the here and now. And when everything is the here and now, you cannot develop a theory of yourself. You cannot see yourself. You cannot, of course, regulate yourself. This presentism, this immersion in the here and now as a threat, the here and now as an exigency, the here and now as a vicissitude. This is what undermines any attempt at self-regulation or regulatory process inside the borderline and the narcissist. This lack of time. They're frozen like ants in amber.